Okay, so we might make a start. Other people might join the session as we go along. Good morning, my name's Emma, and I want to welcome you all to today's webinar, Embedding Inclusion Strategies. We've had a really great response to this webinar, and we're really excited to have you here with us today. I work here at Gowrie SA, and I'm stepping in today for Rose, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And I'll be facilitating here today with Claudia, who will introduce herself in a moment. And we have Kyla here who's doing our tech support, so all our behind the scenes stuff to make sure it all runs smoothly. I've been working in the education and care sector for over 16 years, and I've been here at Gowrie SA for just on 12 years now. I've been working as a team leader in the infant toddler programs up until the start of this year, where I moved over to the inclusion agency and am now working as an inclusion professional. And I think maybe with some of you that are here today. And I'll pass over to Claudia now.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, so I'm Claudia. I've worked in the early years sector for almost 10 years in various roles, my last being an educational leader. I have a passion for inclusion as well as high quality planning and ongoing reflective practices. And like Emma, I'm also an inclusion professional here at Gowrie SA. So before we begin, we would like to just go over some housekeeping. We will be having a break somewhere in the middle of the webinar for 10 minutes. There is also a chat box that we will be asking you to use at times throughout the session. However, due to high volume of attendees and questions, we may not be able to respond to everyone. Therefore, after the webinar, you can reach out to your own services inclusion professional or the agency if you would like any specific questions answered before then. At the end of the session, you will be receiving a survey which will ask you for feedback and any questions you might have about this webinar.
I just want to pause for a moment because I can see that June's saying she can't hear. Is everyone else still able to hear us? Yeah, okay, great. All right. So it might be something on your end then, June. So as some of you would know, one of our core beliefs here at Gowrie SA is around reconciliation. So before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting on today. We recognise that some of you may be meeting from other lands and joining this webinar from somewhere else, but where we are today, we are meeting on Kaurna land. And so I would like to say Ngā Mani. I acknowledge we are here today on Kaurna land. I acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians and native title holders of this land and waterways. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Thank you, Natalia. And so today's webinar is about embedding inclusion strategies into everyday practice. Inclusion and diversity have certainly become buzzwords in recent years, but they are really more than just a passing fad. They're a vital element to a service's practices and their delivery. And inclusion doesn't just happen because we have a statement about inclusion in our philosophy or we have inclusion policies that we have. These are definitely steps towards inclusion. However, there is so much more to consider and reflect upon. In this webinar today, we will share information which will hopefully help you to foster positive attitudes and values regarding inclusive practice within your professional teams. To help us get in the zone, we're going to start by revisiting some of our guiding documents and refreshing what we already know about inclusion. We recognise that inclusion itself is not a strategy. It's not just one item, it's multi-layered. It's about belonging, and that's why it can be difficult to pinpoint because it's going to be different for every individual. So we will unpack the journey towards inclusion here together today. And we'll then look at the foundations for successful inclusion. What are the key elements that are needed to be inclusive? Inclusive practice is planned and it's intentional. So lastly, we'll talk about practical strategies to implement with your team. And I'll now hand over to Claudia.
Thanks, Emma. So let's begin by revisiting a quote from one of our frameworks that you're probably all familiar with. Inclusion involves taking into account all children's social, cultural, linguistic diversity, including learning styles, abilities, disabilities, gender, family circumstances, and geographic location in curriculum decision-making processes. So there's a lot of meanings there. So what does that mean to you? What do some of these words actually mean? What does this look like in practice at your service? We would like everyone to put in a word or a short statement in the chat box that describes inclusion for you. I'll just take a moment for that to come through. So we've got equality and understanding.
Empathy.
Empathy. Equity, honouring, accessibility, including everyone, equal opportunities for all children, everyone is unique, ensuring every child is given a fair opportunity for success, everyone belongs and can participate, belonging, everyone, being aware and respect individuals, including my own culture and lifestyle, acceptance, a feeling of belonging, being welcoming, respectful to others, respect, equity, belonging and connection, including all, not being judgmental, belonging, reflective thinking, opportunities, possibility and hope, respect and belonging, everyone included and belonging. Fantastic. And making sure that all children in our service are heard and valued, and the program reflects this 100%. So to summarize all of that, inclusion means that all children and young people, regardless of their age and abilities, have the same opportunities. This means that each child has opportunities to play and learn, take part in community life, build relationships with important people in their lives, and feel that they belong. When each child has these opportunities, they can grow and thrive. Ultimately, inclusion is a celebration of diversity put into action. So when we talk about each child, we can see this language weave throughout our frameworks. I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the snapshot of our National Quality Standard, or the NQS. The words each child are purposely used throughout the NQS 18 times overall to promote the inclusion of all children. The National Quality Framework, or the NQF, acknowledges the capacity and right of all children to succeed, regardless of their circumstances, cultural background, or abilities. Each of our guiding documents, such as My Time, Our Place and the Early Years Learning Framework, for example, the principles and practices, inform us to develop a shared understanding of inclusion. Like the NQF, all of these documents are designed to guide and support us in providing high-quality, inclusive environments for each child. So each child is diverse. Their experiences will be shaped by their identity, their family's culture and customs, and the community in which they live in. Inclusion means building upon and fostering this diversity. We often link the term inclusion with minority groups, such as people with disabilities. However, inclusion is about everyone, as mentioned. It involves working with every child and family and not just particular groups of children. Inclusion is broader than only considering children with disabilities or additional needs. This slide shows the considerations needed for fostering diversity. So we have children with disability or a developmental delay, children experiencing physical, medical, or mental health conditions, children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, Torres Strait Islander children, Aboriginal children, refugees, gender diverse or gender fluid children, and children from lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or intersex families. Children with complex social, emotional, or behavioural needs, children who are gifted, children experiencing social, economic, or geographic disadvantage, children at risk of abuse, neglect, or family violence, or children in institutional settings, including residential care, refuges, hospitals, and migration detention. Inclusive practice is acknowledging, respecting, and valuing diversity and recognizing the opportunities to learn from each other through meaningful participation. In saying this, we do understand that high-quality inclusive environments cannot happen overnight, and that this is an ongoing journey.
And so what does the journey to inclusion look like? As we talk about today, it's going to look different based on your service and the children and the families that attend, and also the educators that work there. So we're going to unpack this a little bit more. This slide is based on some of the work done by Kathy Colligan, who is a senior lecturer in inclusive education at Macquarie University. And so we're going to start at the bottom there and start by looking at exclusion. And so exclusion is really defined by Kathy Colligan as when children are denied access or excluded from mainstream education settings and are segregated. So where the view might be that all children with disabilities should attend a specialist school, and this might seem extreme, we might be saying to ourselves that this would never happen at our service. However, Have you ever been in a position where you've potentially denied enrolment to a family or seemed unsure about whether you could meet their child's needs because of limited resources or skills within your team? Perhaps there was low educator confidence or limited knowledge about how to include each child. There may even be physical access limitations, or the environment you might feel like is not suitable. Our practices can sometimes unintentionally limit children's access to education and care services, and we will find that families may not enrol their families in a service if they feel that they are not considered, or if they feel like you do not feel confident, or that they are not supported. So then we move to mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is defined as the placement of children in the same environment without any modifications or changes to facilitate inclusion. Therefore, we are providing access for the child, but we're expecting them to fit in with the experiences that we are offering. So an example of this might be that your service is dedicated to delivering Jolly Phonics as part of the Kinder program, and you have some children who find it difficult to participate due to their limited communication skills or perhaps social skills. But they're in your Kinder room and a part of the daily program. Therefore, you want them to participate. You may perhaps be expected to provide these experiences as part of your program commitment, and this could potentially be driven by family expectations to provide school readiness experiences. So then, how do we overcome this? Do we apply for an additional educator to strongly encourage all children to participate in this experience? Or do we consider perhaps how to adapt the program so each child can participate? And so this might seem like majority rules and reminds me of the story of the snow in front of the building. And so if we think of the story of the snow, it had snowed quite a lot and there was quite a large group of people waiting to get into the door via the stairs. And there was one person in a wheelchair waiting at the access ramp. The snowplow was frantically clearing the snow from the stairs where the large group of people were waiting, which then meant that the person in the wheelchair would be waiting for all of the others to go in before the ramp was cleared. But what if they had cleared the ramp first? Then all people would be able to access the building at the same time. So we want you to have a think now, take some time to have a think about what's a practice that you've adapted at your service to meet children's needs, all children's needs, or you've noticed a child couldn't participate, so you adapted it so that all children could. Or perhaps you could think about some practices that are currently happening that you're feeling challenged by, or that you're wondering a little bit about. So just take a few minutes to write some notes, and if you'd like to share with us and the group, you can pop it in the chat as well.
Okay, yeah, picture cards, what's happening now and what's happening next. So playing in a sandpit. Oh, sorry, Carla. Yeah. Lake Brace. So he couldn't get into the sandpit, so we moved the sand to the tables for him and his peers to play with. Great.
Yeah, that really is.
Know the child, offer a variety of experiences to accommodate the needs of all. Exactly. Development of social stories for families to share with children prior to attending an excursion. Fantastic.
That's a great example of a way that you can build that bridge between home and the care setting.
Of course. Communication board, very similar to picture cards, but with picture cards being able to be moved through the day if things change. Adaptable. Yes. That's such a good example, Hayley. Understanding that all children aren't able to sit and listen to a story, so allowing them the freedom to participate in alternative activities. That's such a good example of, accommodating all children's needs, interests, and abilities. We had a child with skin issues, no Sanderland. We set up a pine bark play pit to enjoy this with his friends using trucks and dinosaurs. Spontaneous thinking there.
Oh, that is a great example, Gay.
We're currently exploring foods and recipes from families. This is actually to express the importance of sharing family stories. Love it. Exactly. And, food and recipes are such part of that family's culture that you're sharing within the service as well. We have one little guy who have noticed once we allowed him the freedom to move about, that he actually started to listen from afar instead. It was a structure of sitting on the floor in the group that struggled him. Exactly.
And that really links to what people have been talking about really knowing the children, that the way children participate is going to look so different. And so a child may not be able to join you on the mat. Group time comes up a lot. With inclusion professionals, that's one of the things we talk to services a lot. It's a challenge, it's a barrier. We find that's really common. Seeing the different ways and cueing into how children are participating can be really important there.
Adapting the menu for all allergies. Excellent. I think that, I'm not sure whether we might give an example of this, but, at meal times, there is such a diverse range of children and who have meal requirements. And how are we adapting that for all children? You sit through meal times, large group gatherings. So we allow a separate space for those children are catered for. These are such good examples. I don't even know why you needed to come to the webinar.
Stop. We do hope you get something out of today.
We do.
That's a really great example. We often have meal times that can be very busy. Transitions in and out of meal times, we know, can be times where children become dysregulated, and large groups and the volume, and of course we're hungry at that time, so it's very hard to stay regulated and wait for the pastor to get to you, if there's a large group of children. So smaller groups is a really great example of a way of you can support children's needs at that time.
And I think all of the comments and the stories that are coming through really shows, that, as has been said, you're getting to know each child, and their abilities, their interests, their needs. And I think it shows a lot of reflective practice. A wheelchair accessible garden bed. So there's some really big positive change happening there to include all children. Freedom of choice, definitely. And I think children's autonomy is so important, and that we will actually mention later on in this webinar also.
And what I think is really great about coming to a webinar, you can zoom in from where you are, join us from where you are, but and it's not face to face, but with the chat function, you can hear what other people are doing in services and see how they're reflecting, and they've adapted things for children. A lot of you commented at the start that, it's really about inclusion, it's really about belonging, that sense of belonging. And so you can see in what you're writing here, belonging really sits underneath all of that you're really supporting children to belong and also be in your spaces, to be connected in those spaces, to be able to be engaged.
Yeah, allowing children to flow indoor and outdoor spaces. Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for sharing here. We're going to ask you to use the chat box a few times throughout the webinar, and so that's really helpful so we can get a gauge of also, you know, the inclusion practices that you already have or what you're already focused on as well. And it's great just to be able to share with other people working in other services and across the whole sector, you know, so long daycare, family daycare and OSH. And so what we're going to look at now is we're going to look at integration. So we're going to think about what Colligan describes as integration, which is as attendance at a mainstream setting with needs-based practices to support participation, but no adjustment to the environment. Therefore, we are responding to and accommodating for children and their specific needs. This could be cultural, dietary, or abilities. We may be using specialist equipment, and we might have applied for funding for an additional educator, but we are still expecting the family or the child to fit in with the dominant culture at our service. And so something we could consider here, and something that kind of, you know, happens in most services, is that this could be evident in our transition policies. So in some services, children's transitions from room to room can be based on their abilities. However, we know that children's development can be impacted by a disability, trauma, or even a social economic circumstance. And so this might mean that a child with a disability may never be able to reach that milestone. For example, your policy might state that when children develop the ability to walk, they will transition to the next room. However, a child with a physical disability may never have the ability to walk. And then upon reflection, how might this impact on some families and children? We need to consider, are our policies inclusive of all children? And it's important to reflect on who's advantaged by our policies and who's disadvantaged in our policies. There are many subtle messages that we might be conveying to children and families, weave through our policies and practices, and also through the conversations that we have, which we may have never thought about them as being not inclusive. And so finally, inclusion is valuing and embracing each child's diversity, fostering a sense of, as you all mentioned, belonging, and supporting their full participation. And you've given some really great examples there in the chat box of how you've supported children's participation within your environments. And this will look and feel different for each service due to differences in social contexts, the children that attend, the families, the staff that work there, the community needs and their dynamics, and where you're located. And so in a nutshell, inclusion is the combination of ensuring that every child has access to childhood education and that services embrace children as active participants in their own learning and that every child experiences positive learning outcomes.
So to illustrate what we have been discussing, we're going to play a short video to assist our understanding and appreciation of the power and the promise of inclusive education.
I don't understand why I'm at the back of the class. I wish I was like everyone else. I want to do what they are doing. But here I am doing the same old number activity, watching as my classmates learn something else. Don't they know that they're setting me up to fail? Don't they know they hold my future in their hands? I want to work with my class, learn what they are learning, and do the activities they do. But here I am, stuck at the back, limited by low expectations. Having a one-on-one teacher aide just teaches me to rely on them and means I get less attention from the teacher. I am not included in the classroom. I am in the same room but segregated from my peers, sat to the side or back, working on different things and missing out. I want to be free to learn with my peers, reach my full potential and be seen to be like everyone else. I need something to change. You may be wondering what was wrong with this picture. I am in the classroom with my peers, sitting in my seat, learning the same things as everyone else. You may think this is inclusion, but it's not. I am stifled, limited, and held back from reaching my full potential. Though I love my teacher aide, I don't get to think for myself. In fact, a lot of the time, my teacher aide does it for me, even whispering the answer in my ear when I already know it. The more she is with me, the more I realize that there is no point in me thinking for myself because she will give me the answer anyway. I'm sure there are other kids who also need her help. Does she need to be with me? Can't she help others? Surely if I need help, I can put my hand up and ask my teacher like my friends do. My friends and classmates want to help me, but by having someone right next to me, they can't. I need to learn from my peers, be able to do group work and be challenged. I want to be allowed to fail or succeed and learn from it. I need something to change. Can you find me in the crowd? Inclusion is more than just a word. It is a culture, a mindset, and an expectation that everyone can and will learn and succeed along their age-appropriate peers. I know it can be challenging to include me in the learning, as sometimes I might require extra resources and information, but giving me space to learn from my teacher and peers is the best way to challenge me and allow me to grow. I want to learn the same things as my classmates, and I want teachers to have the same expectations of me as my friends. My learning may need to be modified, but I still want the opportunity to show what I can do, not focus on what I can't. Treat me the same as any other student and watch me flourish. I will rise to the challenge of expectations you set for me. Are you ready to really include me?
So again, that video, it is really powerful and it does show the promise of inclusive education. So what we would like everyone to do now is think back to the practices that you were challenged by or what you were wondering more about. What changes, if any, do you think that you could consider making after watching this video? So we're going to take some time now to let everyone reflect and then put into the group chat or the chat box what thoughts that you have.
So Charlotte's posed a really good question there about a barrier she feels at her site. Sorry, it's just disappeared from the screen. I'm just curious about how it works time-wise. At my service, I have 3 hours admin a week, and it already doesn't stretch far enough. How do I also find time to include children who need extra resources and time? If anyone has any thoughts on that, please feel free to pop some suggestions in there as well. Amy?
So people using the inclusion support staff, not just one-on-one with the child, but to actually support the whole group and the child's ability to join in and feel the circle of security rather than being segregated from their peers.
And that's great, Amy, because that's a perfect example of what an additional educator is for, what that funding is for, is to increase the ratio in the room for all children, so that all children's inclusion is being supported within that care environment.
So April said providing the support for all children and also allowing children to seek support. Exactly. So having educators available for children when they do need it.
We can see lots of people are writing here. Great, Sandra's extended on that point too, that providing one-to-one support to children with additional needs is a barrier to inclusion, because you're limiting their independency, their sense of belonging and their chances to succeed. And we know it's really important for children to be in environments with same-age peers and to be able to participate alongside each other. You know, I think one of the things, I'm just going back to, I think it was Charlotte, perhaps that was the first comment, yeah. You know, one of the things about embedding practices and making changes and embedding inclusive practices is that it takes time. So, you know, don't try and do it all at once because you want to embed them. So think about what are the barriers to inclusion at the moment that we're seeing the most, or, you know, what are things that you feel like you want to focus on first, and then focus on that and implement one thing at a time. So if we're going out as the inclusion professional for a service, we would really work with them to look at, you know, well, what's happening here and what do we feel are, you know, are the really, you know, the big barriers? What do we need to focus on first? So if it's, you know, implementing visuals, then we would just focus on that for a while and support the service to implement that first. So whether that's about making a visual schedule, and someone pointed out, you know, a visual schedule that you can change across the course of the day because routines do, you know, do change
and they are flexible.
Perfect. Yeah. And then also if you're doing lanyards as well, these things, we fully recognize it takes time to develop these resources. So it's about critically reflecting on, you know, who is not able to participate fully at the moment and what are the steps? How can we remove these barriers and what to focus on first? And it's a process. Embedding anything takes that time. So it's just about not trying to do it all at once, breaking it down into bits and pieces. Oh, Lisa, yeah, I love that point about focusing on what children can do and celebrating these together, being really strength-based, highlighting the positive dispositions that children are displaying, the way that children are connecting with each other, you know, building on that sense of self within the environment, so that they have a positive sense of self in your care environments.
And Hayley has said that we struggle at times with educators who find themselves struggling to connect with children with additional needs and don't feel that they can make a connection with the children. They shy away from them and feel more comfortable with the easy children. Okay, well that's, you know, there's a lot to unpack there. You know, when educators are struggling to connect with children with additional needs, you know, you've just got to sort of look, what is the barrier there? You know, and it might be the educator barrier, not the child barrier. You know, there might be challenging behaviours that the educator finds challenging, that they're struggling to, you know, respond to. It's definitely, I think it might be some professional development there. It might be educators' lack of knowledge about the additional need that the child has, that they need some upskilling or some professional development around to make them feel more comfortable and more knowledgeable about that children's need.
Yeah, and critical reflection really plays a good part there. It sounds like you're having conversations there, like educators are highlighting that they're recognising that they're finding it's a struggle. And so I think also, you know, working on, you know, acknowledging the efforts that they're making, and when moments are hard, like that seemed really hard, or that looks like that was a really tricky moment. So holding space there for educators too, so they feel comfortable to talk about that. so that they will seek out their colleagues or leadership to discuss that and say, look, I do find that I tend to, maybe gravitate towards other children. We know that in relationships with children in our services, it's our responsibility to build that connection. It's our responsibility to build that relationship with the child. And so we need to look at, what tools do we need in our toolkit that support us in our work? What professional development do we need to do? What kind of culture do we need to create as a team where we're feeling really supported? And that we recognise sometimes those connections can take potentially longer to build, or might need some more honed focus over time. So then providing our colleagues with space to be able to do that, to spend that time with those children.
Kaz has a toolbox there for each child and strategies, etc.
Can you just go up, Kyla? Sorry. But sometimes we struggle with the mix of behaviours when you have multiple children with challenging behaviours. Yeah, and consistency can be really key there, ensuring that everybody's, having the same responses, so that children know these are the boundaries in the environment when we come. These are sort of the guidelines here in this room. That can help, but it can certainly be challenging.
Yeah, and I think that with, the mix of challenging behaviours is looking at the function of what that behaviour is. Normally behind behaviour there is a want, there is a need, there's a reason for that behaviour. So just looking at what the function of that behaviour might be. Is it that they want access to something? Is it that they are absconding and they're avoiding something? Is it that they want more connection, or albeit, used in services attention? What's the function of behaviour there, to really unpack what's happening for that child, and then responding to those behaviours in appropriate ways, reflecting how you can do that.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us would have seen the iceberg diagram where it's like, the behaviour is the tip of the iceberg. So anger or, throwing something or things like that is the tip that we can see. So what is sitting under the water? What can't we see? All of those things. And sometimes when you're in it with a child, when you're in that moment, when you're in that environment, it's hard. It's hard to notice what that might be. And so, it is important to work with others and have others come in and support you. You can contact your inclusion professional as well. Contact us here and we can come out and observe if you're having some trouble with challenging behaviours. That's part of the work that we do here. So we do really encourage you to reach out and see what support we can offer there as well. Gay shared an idea. We often discuss sharing the load of the whole day. We agree to tag in and out if high need situations occur. And sometimes as educators, it's important to recognise when you just don't have capacity and feeling supported to maybe step out of a moment. It's good to stay connected to children and to come back in as well if you've had a big moment there, and to kind of repair using some circle of security language, which someone mentioned before. But sometimes, you might not be the best person in that moment if you are not feeling like you can stay regulated with the child to continue, and it is good to step out and have someone else maybe step in.
%, Kaz, 100%. I mean, as Kaz has said, they currently have a toolbox that feels empty, as they have a child who has reached at a level that they're not used to. You're exploring ways to support this development and conversing with families and OTs, and you cannot stress enough that every child, families are an important tool, as are OTs, etc. 100%. It takes a village. Families and the community, as we will unpack later, they benefit all parties.
Yeah, and really, when we think about, we'll talk about the strategic inclusion plan a little bit today, but that focuses on the whole environment. Whereas children, if they have an NDIS plan, or if they're working with OTs or speech therapists, they and the family will have particular goals for their child. And you can work in partnership. When we think about inclusion for children, working in partnership with allied health professionals, setting up that relationship, seeing if they can come in and observe in your environment to support you with some strategies there, that can be really helpful. Yeah, Tony, and yeah, that's a great point. That inclusion does look different, and that what might work for a large portion of the group may not work for everyone or one child within your environment. And that's about us being mindful and aware.
And also flexible and adaptable in our practices. Supporting educators to recognise their own triggers and to follow the other children's cues as well. Work with families to have a transparent relationship that supports everyone involved. That's spot on, Tony. You know, look, educators, you know, can do some reflective thinking there in terms of recognising their own triggers. And then, as was mentioned earlier, being allowed to step out and reflect, okay, what are the questions I need to ask myself before being able to respond to what's challenging me?
Yeah, it can be very hard for a dysregulated adult to help a child who is also dysregulated. And it's really important that, yeah, we can recognise that in ourselves. So we need to think about, what do I need to do here in order to become regulated so I can support this child who is in front of me who is feeling dysregulated. See, someone else is typing, so I think it's Tony again. Oh, Amy's typing too, so we're just going to wait a few more minutes while people add some extra thoughts. Has anyone got any suggestions for Charlotte about how they sort of overcome some of those time barriers? You know, we talk about trying to use team meetings, if you've got team meetings, if you've got staff meetings. They may be opportunities to look at what resources you need. Some of you would be aware that we have a specialist equipment library here, so that is free to access and borrow resources from. And Nima runs that, he oversees that. And he is, you know, if you've got questions or if you're not sure what you need, you can definitely contact him and ask him. He's always here to help.
So Tony's added, the biggest question I ask myself in these moments is, what is happening for the child? How does that look and feel for the child and the other children? Exactly right. And I think reflection is such a big part of practice. We need to be able to critically reflect on what's happening, the whys, the wheres, the hows, to be able to respond with high quality. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes for more people to complete their typing. So at the moment, we are experiencing some children's fear of a child who can become aggressive. We want the children to feel safe, but we don't want to reinforce the children's fear of the child. Exactly, Amy. And as we mentioned before, you know, it's really the child who is experiencing some aggression, you know, allowing them to express their feelings, but in a safe way. You know, redirecting them, you know, acknowledging how they feel, communicating the limit, and then redirecting them to a more positive or more appropriate way of expressing their feelings. And also educating the children about feelings, about emotions, about appropriate ways to express their emotions.
And then thinking about what are the strategies you can introduce into that environment to help that child build a positive sense of self, and also so the other children have positive connections with them too. So, you know, can we, you know, what are their strengths in the environment? What do they really enjoy? And therefore, what can we build on? If they really enjoy construction, can we create opportunities where there's smaller groups and that we're there and we're really supportive of those social interactions? And that engagement, and that we're highlighting, you know, what each child is doing. April said sending a quick email to the family. And supporting professionals with your questions, and they may have the time to guide you or provide resources. Exactly, reaching out to professionals, so OTs and speech therapists, they will be familiar with resources. They certainly have supported services with visuals or connections to articles or PDs that are relevant, and they work with the child, so they know that child really well, and so they are recommending things to you that would be relevant for that child and supportive of their inclusion. Yeah, Dominica and Angela, being regionally based, that can certainly be very challenging. Yeah. And so that can make the process longer. Yeah. And that is really unfortunate. Yeah, so using the children's OTs for ideas and strategies all the time. That's great. Children's NDIS plans as well. They've got goals for the year. So looking at how you can, if you can have copies of the NDIS plan, and if you can implement goals that, in your room and in your program.
And normally we have children who do have a diagnosis and a report of that diagnosis. If you do have the opportunity to have access to that, and the families give you permission to view that, at the end of that report, they do give you resources and strategies to the family that you might be able to use in your service as well.
And Kaz, that is a great point, and that is really why we're here today. So, everything we're talking about today applies to all children within your environment. And as you've said, it's very important to think about the fact that the child may not have a diagnosed disability to need extra support. So there's the quiet child, the child with trauma, the popular child, the child with emerging self-regulation. All children require the support, and smaller groups, and that's great. That's really what we're looking at here today, is that it's not just about saying, we're not here today talking about, the children you might put on a funding case for an additional educator, the children with the documentation. We're really looking at the whole service, the whole room, all families, because the other thing is, we don't always know what's going on for children and families outside of our environment. And so when we get to know the individual children, we look at children each and what their needs are, then we can meet them where they are.
Yeah, exactly, Kaz. And as mentioned earlier, each child is diverse. Their experiences will be shaped by their identity, their family's culture, customs, the community in which they live in, and it's building upon and fostering this diversity. So we're just going to have a little 10-minute break now, and once we come back, we'll be discussing inclusive strategies and looking more closely at how to embed these. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. ASIQA states that practice is embedded in service operations when it occurs consistently, frequently, and intentionally as part of an ongoing process that is understood and implemented by all educators across all aspects of the program. Inclusive practice occurs when educators make thoughtful and informed curriculum decisions and work in partnership with families and other professionals. So let's unpack this a little bit further. To embed practice consistently means a long-term commitment and sustained effort in actioning things repeatedly. When practices are used consistently, they are used by all educators all of the time and not just a one-off strategy or exercise. So how can we develop a consistent approach to inclusion? An example of this could be to remain consistent in the language and the terminology that the service uses. By using child-first or person-first language, it places the focus on the individual and not just the trait or diagnosis he or she has. For example, someone might say they're ADHD to describe a child with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Using person-first language, this would change to the child who has ADHD. To be consistent, this language would be used by all educators within all aspects of the program. Another example of consistency could be that the service induction of all educators. The service might strongly believe in attachment theory. Therefore, the service ensures that each educator is trained in circle of security at induction so that practices and understanding is consistent across the whole centre. So to embed practice frequently means that educators, children, and families become accustomed to it happening, as if it was a regular ritual. For example, A service may frequently weave Aboriginal perspectives into their everyday practice. They may begin every day by gathering and saying an acknowledgement of country and paying respect to the local communities. I'll share an example from my experience. I worked in a service where there was a large Chinese community. Towards the end of each day in our nursery room, separation anxiety would come back when the family started picking children up. After reflection about how we could respond to children's culture to support them with this transition, we implemented the Chinese ritual of tea in the afternoon. Children looked forward to and families became accustomed to the ritual and enjoyed coming to collect their child during this cultural responsive experience. So intentionally embedding practice means to be deliberate, purposeful, and thoughtful in your planning and practices. Sometimes intention doesn't look like what you're doing, but sometimes it's what you're not doing. You can have an intention not to act. When children participate in the program, educators can recognize moments for intentional teaching. For example, children may be engaging in a social experience. However, rather than interrupt their play and ask questions about what they're doing, you decide not to interrupt their play because you want to observe what happens during this social experience. It's about being intentional with our actions, asking, is this a moment to step in or is this a moment to step back? All this needs to be part of an ongoing process that is understood and implemented by all educators across all aspects of the program. This means including the cook, the admin, everyone in a whole centre approach. For example, during frequent team leader meetings, the leadership might engage educators in discussions about inclusion that complement the inclusion policy and supports educators to use new understandings to guide their practice. To be inclusive does not mean educators have to be experts. Rather, it requires them to be confident in recognizing when a child and their family need support and knowing what resources to tap into and drawing on knowledge of diverse approaches to inclusion. So there are at least 3 components that we will unpack and look at and discuss. We will provide some practical examples of high quality inclusive practice for each of these themes. So in summary, the focus for inclusive practice should be across the whole service, not just the children who we deem to need support to be included, as well as a focus on collaboration with families and community, and this should be informed by critical reflection.
And so as we've heard from Claudia, critical reflection is one of the elements required in order to make positive changes and embed practices into our service. Critical reflection really allows us to pause, unpack, and sort through our observations and experiences to consider different understandings and to create meaning and shared meaning together as a team. And we're going to give you some examples of how you can lead your team to engage in critical reflection. Your strategic inclusion plan is a good first step and a perfect tool to assist in critical reflection. And you have support from your inclusion professional to help you with this. When creating a SIP, the first step is to reflect on the barriers to inclusion. So looking at the environment as a whole, not just the needs of a single child, as some people mentioned in the chat before. So really thinking about, like, what are the discussions educators are having in your room daily? What are they feeling challenged by? What are the parts of the day, the routines that you feel aren't working, that could be improved, that children are becoming dysregulated in? Claudia gave us a great example just before of the afternoon, routine. So sometimes the transition at the end of the day can look a lot like, the room being packed up and there can be less educators around and potentially children and educators are watching the clock going, Mum will be here soon, Dad will be here soon. And so she really shared an example there where in the nursery room, they looked at actually children are, struggling with separation anxiety at this time. What can we do? What is something we can embed here that we do every day, that there's comfort in that ritual? Also for children, it feels familiar. It's something from their home life brought into the service. So it builds that connection of like, I imagine that would have felt like a big hug for those children, having that ritual at the end of every day, knowing that now it's tea time. And also for those families, I think, coming in and seeing that, how their culture's been respected and woven through a regular part of the room program. So not just potentially a tea ceremony when it's Chinese New Year, but actually it's embedded in the daily. It's a ritual, and therefore it really becomes a part of that room's culture. And then for children who don't have a Chinese background, who might not sit at home and have tea with their family, what a rich learning experience that is there for them as well. And so thinking about, you may have already identified some barriers or areas for improvement in your QIP. So also look at your quality improvement plan. What have you written in there that you want to work on? Because things from your QIP can be implemented into your SIP and they can be connected. So you can make that link there. And then think about, your service philosophy. So come up with strategies that really align with your values and your beliefs that are stated in there to help alleviate those barriers. And so that is how we are starting to embed our beliefs through everyday practice by linking all of this work that we're doing together. And so they don't stand alone. They're all in relationship to each other, and they all support us with our practice and our pedagogy. And then critical reflection is really more than just evaluating or reflecting, though. It requires action or a decision at that time whether action is required or not. So when we critically reflect, we are taking into consideration other perspectives with the intention of making change, and therefore we need to think about the foundations which influence our practices. So the United Nations Rights of the Child can give us a very strong foundation to inform our inclusive practice. Article 12 states that children have the right to give their opinions freely on issues that affect them, and adults should listen and take children seriously. And so then we need to think about how this right will be upheld for children who have limited communication skills, or for younger children. How are we getting their opinions? How are we noticing what they think? Limited communication skills impact the ability to participate fully in group experiences, in interactions with peers, and making connections with peers and adults. And so then what alternative ways of communicating do we have in place so that children can communicate with us? Is the service using visuals consistently throughout the routines, throughout the environments? Are staff using simple keyword signing as a part of everyday practice with all children? How do we capture children's voices? In what ways, in what mediums? Are we using video? Are we scribing? Are we using learning stories? In what ways are we documenting children's voices? And then what are we doing next? How are we sharing that with families? How are we sharing that with other educators? How are we sharing that with the children themselves? What time are we taking to say, I noticed this about you, or I'm wondering more about this? So what are we doing next there? The United Nations Rights of the Child is a really strong document that can help us with our inclusive practice. And I wonder if you have it in your service, if you've got it displayed. Is it something that educators are familiar with? There's lots of you here today, so we're really interested in what are the documents or the frameworks that you're using at the moment to inform your pedagogy and your practice. What is it that educators are working with? We'd love for you to pop some examples into the chat box so everyone can see. Code of Ethics, the ECA Code of Ethics. NQS, EYLF.
My Time, Our Place.
Code of Conduct, yep. If anyone's attended any professional development or any online training recently that you found has been really helpful too, please feel free to pop that in there in the chat box for other services to see. BU, yeah, the service philosophy, trauma-informed practice. Yeah, there's some really great online training around that.
And BU has some fantastic resources on there.
Connect Ed, they do a lot of training around trauma as well. What's in my toolbox training?
Back to BU, actually, BU will actually assign your service a professional that will specifically work with you in your service and the BU resources. So they can be a valuable source of development there.
Oh, and Kerry's extended on that there, saying they've got individual and service environment wellbeing plans. They were templates that were provided by BU Beyond Blue. Yeah, and I think in the last few years, with everything that's been going on in the sector, that's a really supportive service to engage with. Positive partnerships. Circle of security and attachment theory. Smiling mind. Yeah. Oh yeah, there's lots of examples there. This is great. Thank you so much. Yeah. And you can see there how people have referenced that they have their own code of conduct in their services and also their philosophy, that there are lots of documents that we can work with that support us in our inclusive practices, that we can have displayed up in the centre, that we can have in the staff room. And this highlights to children and families, but also educators, you know, we see you are welcome here, that we are on a path of inclusion. And so that brings me to first impressions. You know, first impressions are really important. It can set the tone for the rest of the interaction. The introduction to your service needs to be more than just aesthetically pleasing, more than just a beautiful entrance, although that is certainly lovely. So when a family walks into your service for the first time, they will instantly get a feeling of the culture there. Because the thing is, every environment has a culture, whether we recognise it or not. So it's really about reflecting what is our culture here, and what do we want our culture to be. Educators may be friendly and they may say hello, but is that consistent across the service? Are the environments indicative that we are inclusive? So how are the diverse range of children and families in your community reflected in the environment? Do they really feel a sense of belonging? Can they see themselves there? This needs to be a whole centre approach. It needs to be visible in the environment and felt through the interactions and conversations. And there needs to be consistency. You know, when a family arrives, do they see the information that they've shared in the getting to know you forms that they might have filled out before they started reflected in the environment? If they shared information with you about the fact that at home they have, you know, tea or things like that, is that reflected in the home corner? Is their family model reflected in the resources that you have? So in the dolls or in the stories that you have displayed in the book corner, can they look around and go, I can see my family here. My child will see their family here. So multiple means is about critically reflecting on the physical learning spaces and ensuring that the environment supports children's autonomy and their varying needs. And thinking about, can they participate fully in the environment? Can children access experiences at varying levels? So we saw some examples of that earlier where people were talking about how they had created wheelchair accessible garden beds, or how they'd thought about children who, you know, could not play in sand, or how they'd thought about children who could not access the sandpit. There needs to be more than just one way for children to express themselves, to show who they are, what they know and what they need. And so this requires us to really get to know children, to observe them in our spaces too, and to be aware of the ways the environment might be limiting children's engagement and participation, and then reflecting on what strategies need to be put in place to remove those barriers. So someone shared a great example before of, you know, a group time might work, or a big game might work for the whole group or a large portion of the group, but there may be one or two children that do not come and join that because they find that overwhelming. So it's about us noticing, you know, what we are planning and what we are programming and who is not engaging, and then critically reflecting on why that might be. Terminology, what language are we using? What language do we use when we're talking about children? As Claudia touched on before, are we using child first language? Is inclusive language used throughout the educational program, including in documentation and the service policies and procedures? Is the reader able to identify children's voices through the documentation and the signs and displays within the centre? How are we talking to children? How are we talking to families about children? And how are we talking to others in the sector about children? Are we using and promoting inclusive language and current inclusive practices? And next, we move to community. So thinking about what do we know about your community, and then how is that reflected in your environments and the culture of your service? So Claudia will talk to us about how to build partnerships and connections with community.
Thank you, Emma. So following on from this, it is not a new idea to collaborate with parents in the community. Effective partnerships foster children's access, inclusion, and participation in the curriculum. We know that building and maintaining a collaborative culture with families and the community within services is difficult. However, it is one that will greatly benefit all parties in the long run. Effective family and community engagement practices should first be developed, built, and then sustained. So let's have a look at different approaches to engaging families in the community to support inclusion. Taking a holistic approach involves viewing something as a whole, being interconnected, understanding the bigger picture. We do this for families where we have a complete view of all children's learning environments, not only in services, but children's home life and the life in the community. A holistic service might offer events where people of the community or families come to the centre and participate in learning and experiences. Learning is then transformed into a social and family experience. Services also do this when they invite families to visit the centre on tours, meet the staff, and connect with other families. This helps the service learn about the children's individual context. The best place to start is with orientation and showing families around the service. Leadership can talk to the families about their expectations, find out what they do for a living or what interests they have to see how they might be able to contribute to the service if they want to. Once we learn about children's individual context, we can use this to transform our learning and environments, thoughtfully reflecting children's home cultures, as Emma mentioned. So engaging with families should be organic, emergent, experimental, and based on cooperation. All families and services want the best for their children. Inspired by the philosophy of Reggio Emilia, families are the first and continuing educators of their children. And leadership is critical to develop, building, and sustaining these partnerships. So how do we do this? We do this by valuing the family's knowledge and understanding a family's perspective, and truly understanding that every family is unique. Incorporate the family's priorities into their child, into all planning. Develop goals for children in collaboration with the families. We need to get to know the goals and aspirations that families have for their children and involve them in decisions about their child's education. When services engage closely with families to support their child's toileting needs, for example, the service helps not just the children, but can also help the family through this developmental milestone. The service might provide fact sheets and will follow what the family has started at home to ensure consistency. But services may need to go beyond collaborating with families and caregivers to incorporate a variety of other professionals and support services. As a lot of you mentioned earlier, connecting with allied health professionals, OTs, speech pathologists, to inform your practices. When engaged with the inclusion agency, for example, professional conversations with your inclusion professional or IP will support service leaders and educators to reflect better understanding current inclusion practice, as well as identify service strengths. Inclusion agencies have a network of inclusion professionals like us who can provide practical, tailored advice and support to services. Ways that services might engage with inclusion agencies is through staff meetings. IPs can facilitate staff meetings for whole service to develop educated knowledge around inclusion, or engage in reflective discussions with the team. The service may also learn a range of specialist resources from the specialist equipment library to enable children to access and participate in all aspects of the program. As mentioned a few times, there may be various allied health professionals involved in supporting a child. Working closely with families and in collaboration with allied health professionals support a consistent approach to children's needs and strengths and their ongoing development. Work with the child's families as well as the professionals, supporting the child to set some specific and measurable outcomes. A child's speech pathologist, for example, may have recommended using visuals to encourage communication and suggested using now and next visuals to support transitions, as someone was doing earlier. I worked with a child who had a significant delay, and I had no knowledge of the disability. I had no idea how to include them. I was really struggling, even after support from my leadership team. So therefore, to inform and assist me in my practice, I reached out to the specific organizations of that disability, and I collaborated closely with them. Ultimately, that supported me and the child in helping them be included in the room. So this shows working together can lead to a shared understanding of the child, their goals and strength-based strategies that are consistent across other environments like home and the community. So earlier, Emma mentioned about knowing about your community. What do you know about your community? The demographics. Who's in the community? This is where you can use the Australian Early Development Census data. I'm not sure if many of you have heard of it. Please let us know if you have or haven't. But this can give you a bird's eye view of your community. The AEDC data provides a snapshot of children's development within the community. This information can inform services and support planning, policy, and action. Data collected by the service could inform a whole service critical reflection on ways that they can deliver the best development opportunities and outcomes for children. Understanding the community data can help educators better understand children's needs. An example of how the data could be used to inform your planning and practice could be to identify emerging issues. For example, an increase in the number of children requiring further assessment, or a decline in children accessing centre-based care or preschool. Your community profile summarizes the data and is a valuable resource for services in knowing their community. It gives so much more information than just on children's development. It gives you the demographics. It tells you the percentage of families not proficient in English. It gives you the demographics of who might be from a country other than Australia.
I just want to pause for a minute. Sorry, Kira, Kyla, sorry, I got distracted by seeing your name, Kira. Can you scroll up? I just wanted to look at what was written before about getting to know you forms.
I find myself sighing when we talk about the About Me forms. We do not get them back. We know families rely on conversations with families and children we document. We have lessened everything from forms to single questions. That's a good point, Kaz. I think that, an All About Me form, and I think that when we talk about collaborating and building partnerships with the families, I think that those All About Me forms or getting to know you forms should be done in collaboration with the family. An example of this might be during orientation. Take time for the family to sit down with the educators in filling out those forms together. Families and educators can really unpack those questions deeper about all about that child. There might be a question: what food do you eat at home? And when you send a form back, they might be really quick in their answering. But when you sit down with the families and do those forms in collaboration, you can really unpack, what food they eat, why they eat that maybe, when they eat that food, where they eat that food. You can really unpack those questions on a deeper level to get to know the culture of that family.
And also, I think, educators can feel that out themselves over time as they get those responses and they ask those questions in conversation, so not necessarily a formal form. If families aren't responding to the questions in the getting to know you form, then thinking about what are the questions? Do the questions represent everybody? What might be some questions that could be more engaging for families? I have children, and sometimes when I get the "what do you celebrate" question on forms, it's like, well, birthdays, Christmas and Easter. So there's not a lot that I write there. So thinking about what else can we ask families. And sometimes when you ask families about culture, they don't necessarily recognize that you're asking about their family culture in terms of like every Friday night we go to the central markets and have noodles, and every Sunday we go for a bike ride along the Torrens and stop for a baby chino. So, also talking to families about like, that what their culture is broader than, sometimes what people think that question might be. Considering if there's a language barrier. So if families are multilingual, can you get some of these forms translated into other languages? And then looking at, other ways you capture their voices. So, you might not get much of a response on a form if you use floor booking. Some services do floor books in the room. In the room I used to work in, we used to pose a question on a floor book at the sign-in bench, and questions like, what did you do on the weekend? Or, what's growing in your garden? Or things like that, to get responses, and it captured different voices. And then what we would do is we would incorporate what families fed back to us there to within the program, and then go back to them and be like, oh, we, noticed that you wrote this. So, a lot of families said they have baby chinos. So then we explored having baby chinos and bringing that into part of our ritual for meal times. And then we shared that back with families to say, a lot of families shared with us that on the weekend you're having baby chinos. And so we did some baking here, and we made some biscuits, and we had a baby chino party. And so when families can see that the information that they provide is then incorporated into the program, that you connect it somehow and you find it, and then they feel like it's important, like it matters that they tell you that information, and they can see that it's reflected.
I just want to if you could go up, I just wanted to touch back on the AGC data. I had some responses from that, so just go down a little bit. So some people have said that they are using the AGC data, some haven't even heard of it. And Domenica and Angela has said that this data is collected in the child's first year of school and not before. That's correct. So the data is actually collected at a reception age, that reception teachers, are given this survey and they complete the survey. But what this can do for services, when we talk about early years or even OSH services, what this data can do, and especially in the early years, is can inform your practice to how do we make a difference, or how do we make a change? How do we prevent that these children are going to be vulnerable in these domains or more? I'll give an example. So the AEDC data covers 5 domains along with other community data. So the 5 domains are, without going into too much context, are social competence, emotional maturity, physical abilities, language and general knowledge, cognitive. And what you see from this data is, once you look up your suburb, so the data goes Australian-wide, state-wide, and then it can go suburb-wide. So let's say you're in I'll just take our suburb, so Theberton. You look at the demographics of Theberton, you might see that you have a large percentage of children who are vulnerable in their physical abilities. So how then can we use this information to inform our practices? How can we use this information, and what can we do in planning or practices to allow children to develop their physical abilities? So, another example might be that you have children who are low or largely vulnerable in their emotional maturity. So you give opportunities for children to develop their emotional maturity, opportunities to regulate themselves, emotional literacy. That's how you can use the data to inform your planning and inform your practice. Even with emotional maturity, let's say you do have a large cohort of children who are vulnerable in that area. Regardless of what you plan, what are you going to use in practice? What language are you going to use? When children do need assistance to regulate their emotions and need co-regulation, what language are you going to use? How are you going to respond to that emotion and help them, guide them through it, educate them on appropriate ways to respond to their emotions?
And I just want to touch on Kaz's comment here. So she's saying, we've changed the questions to suit our current families. We get the general no time excuse. Yeah, I mean, time is an issue. And then saying we have gone to focusing on 5 questions and asking the child about their family. And then we talk to the family members about their response and we get more information. And this is a new way for us. And that is that's an excellent strategy, working, capturing the child's voice. And then that's inviting family input and getting more information that way. I think that's a really perfect example of reflecting on something that seemed to be not working and thinking about how else you could do that.
So this leads us to practice. We've been informed by critical reflection, we've collaborated with the families and all the community. Now we need to put it all into practice. So we've provided some strategies on how inclusion can be embedded in service operations. Earlier, Emma mentioned the Strategic Inclusion Plan, or the SIP. So this plan is a self-guided assessment and planning tool for services. It helps services be prepared to engage all children in the program. So you've developed a strategic inclusion plan. What next? First, we want to make sure that all educators have access to the information on the SIP. Services can print the SIP for each room, and your inclusion professional can help you, guide you and navigate how to do this. And we've also seen services display their SIP for the benefit of not just educators, but all families and community people. What this does is it ensures input onto the SIP, but also ensures consistency across the service and assists educators in implementing the SIP strategies and actions, as well as discussing their progress as a team. For example, imagine you're a screenwriter and you've written a fantastic script. However, on opening night, the actors hadn't read it. They've got to improvise on stage and the play falls apart, having no direction. The script was completely meaningless, and I doubt the show would receive positive feedback. And if the educators are unaware of the SIP, the situation would be the same. The SIP should outline clearly what educators will do to support children's learning and inclusion, and ultimately complements the educational programs and practices. When planning for inclusion, we must adopt a child-centered approach that caters for the diversity of all children and takes into account all skill levels. If children with complex needs attend your service, adjust the program so it reflects the abilities, interests, and maturity of their age group. Think about how children will engage with the experience. Think about how the information is presented to the children. Think about how the children are encouraged to respond and express themselves in relation to that experience. In our curriculum, we also want to intentionally expose children to diversity. This could include trying different foods from cultures, interacting with a diverse range of people, reading diverse books, or attending multicultural events. In developing an inclusive program, we want to facilitate positive peer relationships. We can do this by actively teaching children how to be inclusive, building empathy and understanding. This will benefit all children, socially, emotionally, and academically. As leaders, we also want to strive to provide professional development opportunities where your team can learn or deepen their understanding of inclusion practices and principles with support. In speaking about principles and practices, the EYLF will highly guide inclusive education. The principles and practices give a complete inclusive agenda. When you look closely at the principles and practices, you can see how they underpin inclusive practice. For example, in your environment's literacy space, you'll probably have a wide variety of books to suit children of all different ages, interest stages, and abilities. Some additional ideas could be to provide audiobooks as an alternative method to supporting children's language, or books that are essentially free of text so that they portray a story visually. It's also vital to provide books that represent diverse cultures, traditions, and languages. These highlight the practices of being responsive to children and cultural competence, as mentioned in the practices. Our ability to develop a common view of inclusion is supported by the principles and practices. They represent a sound understanding of inclusion. Culture is central to a child's individuality, identity, and a sense of belonging. When we think about culture, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Put in the chat what when I mention the word culture, what's the first thing you think of? I'll take some time for people to add to the chat. Home, family. A group, values, experiences, values and beliefs, customs, our identity, past, present and future, different backgrounds, background that children come from, parents' practices and home life rituals, community, customs, social behavior, community the child grows up in, lifestyle, our service culture of country kids and farming, practices prior to engaging in an ECH service. Family, lifestyle, chosen way to live. Beliefs. So the first thing some people might think of might be the country that we're from or the language we may speak. But as mentioned, culture encompasses more than just that. Culture could be defined as all the different ways in which people live. Culture is the normal way of life, values and beliefs that a group of people practice. For example, the culture of eating in front of the TV every evening is one that most families might do, but other families would eat in front of the dining table each night. Knowing this, how could we embed this knowledge into our service? Perhaps we could include a long dining table and chairs to encourage a family-style dining experience for all children, knowing how they eat dinner at home. To develop high-quality inclusive practice, we need to think deeper about what families and way of life might be and how this is reflected and responded to in our service. So our service culture and our view of children is strongly demonstrated in the way that we speak about children. Especially as a leader, how we speak about and refer to children is incredibly important. Our words are a powerful tool that can uplift, support, engage, and empower others, but they can also disengage, offend, and disrespect, and even exclude others. For instance, the use of the umbrella terms such as Asians ignores the multiple ethnicities within Asia. Acting on inclusion means understanding, using, and promoting inclusive and respectful language. This is not optional, but essential for genuine inclusion. How we speak and the words we choose should be purposeful and our words carefully selected. You could ask each child, as mentioned earlier, and talk to their family about what language they prefer, so you and your team could use the right language for them. Finally, our philosophy. We want to ensure all of this is evident in our philosophies. Keep your philosophy, policies, and processes relevant. By reviewing your services philosophy and policies on a regular basis, you can see how they represent inclusive values and beliefs, as well as a commitment to inclusion. Inclusive practice should be in line with and evident in the service's inclusion policy and service philosophy, this being the foundation of inclusive practice. So how do you know when a practice is truly embedded? A service recently stated to me that it's when a child takes their learning home and shares it with their families and in their community. Would you say the same? I'll take some time again to let you give some examples of what you think embedded practice is and how you know when a practice is embedded. second nature and it happens automatically. When it happens without you even having to think about it, it's just a natural part of the day. Doing something without thinking about it, when it comes naturally to children, when it's an automatic response. It's part of your life, when it happens automatically. When a child is driven and it occurs consistently. When it's child driven and it occurs consistently. We learn the practice first, we know it's embedded when it's automatic.
When the
children remind the educators that it's time.
I always think too, you can tell when practices are embedded if there's relief staff in the room and they're not as familiar potentially with some of those routines and rituals. And when children say, oh, hang on, like actually we sing Ninamani Welcome at the start of each mealtime. So when, the children speak up and let them know, actually, no, wait a minute, there's something that we do here.
So in summary, when a practice is embedded, you can see the children and the educators are confident and skilled in that practice.
Thanks, Claudia. So we wanted to conclude today by sharing an example of embedding practice from a service. So this story that I'm going to share here comes from Loxton Community Childcare Centre, and both the artist involved in the service has given us permission for us to share the story with you. And so this really pulls together a lot, I think, of what we've been talking about here today. So this project was sparked by an action from the services RAP in relation to inclusive environments and promoting cultural safety. The service began by focusing on and reflecting on their physical environments with the intention to make changes which were meaningful and sustainable. So the first place the service started to reflect upon was their entrance. And they wondered, does it feel welcoming here? And what does it say about cultural safety and inclusion? Do people feel that they see themselves here? This then led to them engaging with a local Aboriginal artist, Daniel Giles, and they spoke together about the land and how they could incorporate some of the significant aspects of the local environment which are relevant to the service and the local community. Educators and families and children agreed on the final design, and the artist created a mural depicting the river as their meeting place and animals relevant to the room's names. The service then went on to create a watermark which they are using for children's documentation, letterheads and any other formal communications from the service. They are continuing their engagement with the local artists to ensure that the colours and the themes are used throughout the whole service and that these then become a visible talking point which can spark further reflection.
So we would like to thank you all for attending today, and we do hope you've taken information away with you that will support your service's inclusion journey. In case you missed anything today, there will be a recording for you to refer back to. Now, at the end of the webinar, your views are really important to us. So before you leave, please provide feedback on this session by filling out your post-webinar survey. Thank you again.
And remember, with all of these things, it takes a team approach and to work together to implement and embed inclusion practices. And so know that you can reach out to your inclusion professional and they can come out and facilitate training and staff meetings with your team as well around this. So it doesn't just fall on you. And if you have any questions or anything that you're wondering about after this session, or further information you'd like, you can contact your IP or the inclusion agency here as well.
And even if Emma and I have mentioned something that you would like more information, and we're more than happy to answer any questions or give more information on that too.
And your feedback that you provide here will really guide us in thinking about what it is that you're looking for in webinars, and if we are to plan and host another one, what the content for that you'd like to see. So it's really valuable to us what you write here.